Hi everyone, Masharia here. Yeah, I'm here. Hi everyone, Masharia here. Pronounce he, him. Congratulations.
Hello everyone. Congratulations to both teams. My name is Zarima Manyara, preferred pronouns she or they. Best of luck.
Hi, I'm Yeju. No preferred pronouns. Best of luck to both teams.
Great. If I could just get the teams to verbally introduce themselves and their speaking order and preferred gender pronouns if they wish, starting from the proposition, please.
Hello everyone, my name is Caleb Low and I'm the first proposition speaker.
Hi, I'm Tajay Puducherry and I'll be the second proposition speaker as well as the reply speaker.
Hi everyone, I'm Harith. I'll be the third proposition speaker. All of us would prefer verbal POIs.
Hi.
All right, proposition.
Hi, I'm Madeline and I'm the first speaker.
Preferred pronouns?
Preferred pronouns, she, her.
Oh, okay. I'm Jenna. I'll be the second speaker and reply. Preferred pronouns, she, them.
I'm Chloe. I'll be the third speaker. Preferred pronouns, she, her.
And we're all good with verbal POIs.
Great. I'll ask all speakers to please time themselves. On the motion, this House supports the glorification of the mediocre life. I call upon the first proposition speaker. Hear, hear.
Testing, can everybody hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
My father recently had a midlife crisis. He was just like the vast majority of us, not a Fortune 500 CEO, nor a multi-millionaire celebrity. Yet, he felt his life had amounted to little, simply because on their side, he would simply not have achieved enough. Proposition believes that you do not need to be wildly successful to be enough. Mediocrity is a common reality, and it's something people deserve to be happy with. What does glorifying a mediocre life look like? 1. It means that we will extol the virtues of an ordinary life. For instance, spending more time with your family when you aren't a jet-setting CEO. Therefore, we support the media focusing on experiences accessible to the ordinary person. For instance, newspapers publishing articles on how careerists tend to be less happy and are more stressed with more health issues because of the long hours they work. Therefore, what is our stance? 1. We support the glorification of a mediocre life. 2. To be clear, this does not mean we have to glorify life of suffering and starvation, because this would be considered extremely beyond the pale and a terrible life that does not meet the definition.
Point of information.
No, thank you. A mediocre life simply is one that does not achieve any great success or failures, not one characterized by deep suffering. 3. Crucially, opposition cannot stand for a coexistence of different narratives promoting mediocrity along with different types of success. This is because these narratives will cease to have any effect apart from leaving the individual confused, because contradictory narratives simply cancel each other out. Therefore, as I will explain in my argument, their comparative has to be one where there is a single metric of success that defines all people. 3 arguments. 1. We make people significantly happier. 2. We ameliorate minority rights. My second speaker will tell you how they increase greed. First argument then, that we make people...
Point of information.
Before that, I will take the point.
Given that different communities tend to have different standards of what is mediocre, is it more or less likely that your side will entrench wealth inequalities?
I suspect that most people in the world right now believe that wealth is the main way in which you measure success, and that is the proxy that most people use. I will explain to you later in my first argument why this is the metric that is going to be used, and in my second argument why in fact we help minorities better by your very own metric. I will flag you when I get there. First argument then, that we make people on our side significantly happier. The premise of this argument is that on both sides, people will lead mediocre lives for 3 reasons. Firstly, because success tends not to be achieved by most people, given that it relies on arbitrary factors like luck, which ensure that you're able to win a debate competition or a championship. 2, oftentimes because these needs require specific skills, which oftentimes most people cannot simply achieve through good luck or through hard work, but rather have to be born innately into them. Finally, because people tend to be disenfranchised and face structural barriers, which means that they cannot achieve the success they want no matter how hard they try. Therefore, achieving success is difficult on their side of the house. Crucially, success cannot be defined on subjective metrics. Success is based on its exclusivity, and therefore people have an incentive to make only a small number of people achieve that success on an objective metric. Given that on their side, people will want to make it seem elusive to have success, people will oftentimes pursue success as something that is only achievable by a small minority of people. Rather than success being subjective, it is often relational, measured against people in your own proximity and against people that you already know. For instance, in Singapore and Hong Kong, the fact is that we have large middle classes that would be considered extremely wealthy by historical standards. But the fact is that many of them would still be very unhappy and will not achieve success, since oftentimes they have to compare it against the wealthy people in that country who would be wildly successful. Why then is this bad for their case? This is because if most people are unable to achieve success, under their in the absence of glorifying the mediocre life, the world is governed by forces which force the continued pursuit of a successful life, making people only unhappier when they cannot achieve this goal. There are 3 reasons why this is likely to be comparative on their side. And here I'm going to take them on their POI and explain to you why this is necessarily their comparative. Firstly, because economic capitalism means that in the status quo, you need money to buy things, to achieve any kind of things you want for your own comfort and self-actualization. Therefore, this is already a proxy for success, since this is tied to how well you can live your life. 2, because on their side, there's innate evolutionary competition. Absent of any other narrative in society, people default to their base instincts, and as a result want to pursue superiority over others. As a result, they will oftentimes want to seek success on their side of the house. Finally, on their side, people who already lead a traditionally successful life will be the ones who control the narrative and define how other people see themselves. These people control the media and the culture and can create a seductive notion of what wealth is like and what success ought to be. Therefore, since this is already the predominant narrative now, there is no reason why this will change under their side of the house unless the next speaker gives us huge reasons for why this is likely to change. The upshot of this is that people under their side are unhappy. The fact is, many are likely to fail and are therefore deeply discouraged on their side of the house, where they're immured into a lack of satisfaction, where they have to continuously compare themselves against other people, where the fear of failure necessarily means that they are unhappy because they do not want to look mediocre. But even in their best case, where people can achieve some modicum of success, they still feel disempowered. They are unlikely to want to invest in their present happiness because they gaze into the future and hope that perhaps they can have happiness again in the future. Therefore, they are very unlikely to want to make themselves happy now, given that they often think that their money can be better invested. Therefore, people on their side are anxious, dissatisfied, trapped in a hedonistic treadmill where oftentimes they often think they need to pursue more and more and more. On the comparative, with a mediocre life, people can find contentment. Happiness can be found when you are no longer given the space and the expectations that you have to meet. People are not mired in malnutrition. Under our side, we change the attitudes that they have to life and therefore make them much happier. Second argument then, that we ameliorate minority rights. The premise of this argument is that in the status quo, notions of mediocrity are used to characterize minorities on their side of the house. Muslim migrants depicted as slothful and lazy. Indigenous Americans romanticized as primordial and having lives of nothingness. Therefore, on their side, this is used to deny them basic rights, given that they are thought of as being people who are mediocre. Obviously, our side's case does not apply in cases of outright oppression, since this is likely to be symmetrical on both sides of the house. But on our side, this does not apply to our case, because oftentimes people who live within these conditions know that they do not lead a mediocre life and will continue to agitate to ensure that they achieve one. But our side's difference from their side is that we can engage the narrative of slothfulness and mediocrity head on. Pre-colonial lifestyles are no longer disparaged because they are seen as being non-Western or because they are seen as being different from the rest of society. Without capitalism and its unending pursuit of success, they are no longer seen as innately reproachful simply because they act in a different way from other people. Perhaps on our side, racist people might gravitate to other narratives of what mediocrity is like. But crucially, given how deeply ingrained the narrative of mediocrity is, at least we get rid of the most insidious form of oppression for minorities today. Therefore, outside of the house, we are likely to guarantee more basic rights for people, and simply because they are mediocre by Western standards will not mean that they are denied any of those rights on our side of the house. For all of those reasons, we believe that mediocrity of the mind is the strength of the soul. We are proud to propose.
I thank the proposition first speaker for that fine speech. Call upon the first speaker of the opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Oh, okay. Proposition may believe that winning this debate is about luck, but opposition refuses to flip a coin and give this debate to Singapore. Alike to Hong Kong refusing to lose this round, we refuse to allow minorities to lose hope in trying even when their circumstances are hard. 3 pieces of substantive that opposition will forward. Firstly, why there's a decrease in productivity without this narrative and why that's particularly harmful. Secondly, why it further entrenches existing inequalities and flips Singapore's claim on helping minorities. Thirdly, Jenna will talk to you about why there's subjective standards of happiness and success and why the absence of glorification is particularly harmful. Before I move on to 2 pieces of rebuttal, let's firstly quickly clarify our stance and the counterfactual we envision. We would accept narratives that exist in the status quo already. We think it is rather naive for Singapore to think that we can only pick one or the other, when the reality is currently many narratives of success and happiness already coexist in society. It looks like the narrative of trying hard, the narrative of valuing achieving success, the narrative that success is not blindly chasing after money, but rather it is about sometimes the friends and the experiences you get along the way. Surely some people may have failed, but you are still better off now than you were before in the absence of trying and in the absence of that process. 2 pieces of rebuttal following. Firstly, Singapore claims that they increase happiness because mediocre is the common reality and success is relational. A, recognize what proposition concedes. Success is relative to those around them. Not everyone around you is Bill Gates. Therefore, in general, the comparison doesn't make people feel utterly terrible about themselves. They have overinflated their impact and is highly unrealistic. Secondly, success is likely hard on both sides, and we concede that. But you are happy with the process itself. Surely, you might not be the most successful, but we think in general, individuals can be more content, more proven and substantive. Thirdly, their claim is that opposition now values success based on money because of capitalism and status versus they get contentment. We don't think it's true because we think money doesn't have inherent value. At the end of the day, cash is a piece of paper. People value the good traits and activities that lead to more happiness because very intuitively, being happy makes people happy. People in the status quo also value things like family time. That belief system must exist for Singapore's narrative to exist in the first place. What they said about extolling the virtues of family time, for example. Also, given wealth is admired in some cases because it indicates other good things, like we praise CEOs because we assume they are hard workers and skilled. We also like wealth because it means they are able to buy and do things they like, able to give their children good education, live in nice home, and do nice leisure activities. When wealth counters all of these things and comes at a great cost to them, yes, some people are stuck on the treadmill, but loads of people won't think it's worth it on their side of the house. Secondly, on minorities, this will mostly be directly in clash with some quick pieces of highlighting, because we think the notions of mediocrity they claim are used to characterize minorities in bad light. We say there are different definitions of what mediocrity is, and it's often based on your surroundings, as they themselves concede. Therefore, ultimately, it means that minorities' expectation of what a mediocre situation is far worse than others, and therefore they tend to be the ones most disadvantaged. First point, why is society less productive overall? The premise of this argument is our society is best when people are making big decisions that require a lot of effort, and might entail some risk, but yet yield wonderful and necessary results. This looks like people going into entrepreneurship. The biggest innovations in medicine that saves lives are likely to happen on our side, where people aren't willing to put in the massive amounts of work needed to make it happen on theirs. But it also works on a smaller scale. People are less likely to want to pursue their dreams and take on risks. But this stuff is all essential. This is when people open up grocery stores in food deserts, when people open up legal clinics for battered women, even when individuals make useful decisions, like deciding to go to university when it's hard and when people in their high school have never been. We think our decisions are motivated by more effort. 3 mechanisms. Why is it better on our side? 1, because we think on their side, they're less likely to take risks versus on ours. There's a wide spectrum of this, as I told you in the premise. On the smaller scale, it looks like sacrificing and studying for more. Secondly, it looks like on a larger side, investments and economic interests. Thirdly, we think in many cases, it looks like a child from disadvantaged family backgrounds, encouraged by her family to seek work after high school instead of pursuing a university degree. The former seems more attractive, but the latter is often something that gets them to a higher position after all. This is true because there's already a disincentive to take risks given the massive costs that come with it. It is easier for the individual to opt for the comfortable excuse and retreat. Secondly, we think people in general are less likely to work hard and try hard. They become less ambitious at work. You're less ambitious to ask for a promotion and promote yourself to a higher level. Fewer people see the need in innovation. In general, we think society progresses worse. This is bad because A, there's a decrease in progress that benefits everyone. B, even on a smaller scale, when we close small gaps in the market by individuals achieving success. For example, as I told you, opening legal clinics for women, these also vastly benefit others, and we highly encourage this. Thirdly, more importantly, the narrative that Singapore proposes is an active act of shaming. There will be a narrative in society that people who have pursued and achieved success have lived meaningless and empty lives, that they have thrown away their life in the essence of money or for glory. This narrative can somewhat be seen in the status quo, with the wealthy being seen as soulless elites who are entirely different to us. The proposition has to accept this, because it is hard to convince the average individual that living a life in a fancy mansion and never having to worry about financial issues is bad. Why is this then bad? Because we shouldn't shame those who work hard. It is unjust to criticize those who contribute most to society. And secondly, most importantly, it discourages future success and productivity to every individual on ground. Given success is already seen to be difficult, individuals then become even less incentivized and have no reason to pursue success. Even upon achieving it, the end of the tunnel is empty and a life of misery. Before I move on to point 2, I'll take a few.
Your stance tells us that there will be a subjective measure of what happiness is. Yet, your argument about productivity requires there to be an objective metric such that resources are allocated to the correct areas. Which is correct?
We reject the premise that just because there's subjective metrics of what is success, therefore society cannot efficiently allocate money. We think that's absurd. Individuals can make small contributions that ultimately lead to better outcomes. Secondly, why it further entrenches existing inequalities. The premise is we currently live in a society of vast inequality and societal differences, where an average African-American family will make 1/5 of what the average white one will. To lock those out who have been most societally disadvantaged in a cycle of failure is morally abhorrent. Why does this mean? We think that in many cases, this narrative affects different groups differently, because we think minorities are particularly harmed. If from a young age you have been told as a Black, you're born for a life of mediocrity, you're born for a life where you're bound to repeat the same jobs your father did and you can never elevate your class. Many cases of oppression are not a matter of having food on the table or not. It was the internalized oppression, the ability to accept the fact that you should be content in this scenario when you absolutely should not and do not deserve to be. Secondly, the worst part is that this does not affect everyone equally, because mediocrity is not the same across the board for all people. Someone who is born in a decent household might view mediocrity as a 3-bedroom apartment in the suburbs. On the other hand, those born in a trailer park in Oregon see mediocrity as a 1-bedroom apartment in Hong Kong. You see that as a cage home in many cases. Possibly, this is terrible. We don't think this is something we should actively encourage, because it further worsens the metrics of what is mediocrity, which means the individuals that deserve to be empowered are the ones most harmed and most buyed into this narrative. In conclusion, all that glorification achieves is entrap those in the most vulnerable in a cycle of failure, when incentivizing the most privileged to perpetuate their lifestyle, failing those we owe the most obligation towards.
I think the first opposition speaker for that fine speech call upon the second proposition speaker. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep, you're good.
I'm going to look at 3 areas in the speech. First on happiness, second on productivity, and third on the position of minorities. But before that, let's look at the comparative opposition sets out. We told you in first why their comparative cannot be a multitude of narratives for 2 structural reasons. First, this produces no effect. If multiple competing narratives propagate in society, then this merely confuses individuals since they contradict each other and have no effect. Secondly, and more importantly, we showed you why narratives on their side are controlled by the powerful. Individuals who achieve success have a greater ability to propagate narratives because they control media, for example, and have greater societal clout. This is why you do compare yourself to Bill Gates in the world of opposition, because Bill Gates has the power to splash his face all over TV and magazines. And that is why your sense of success is compared to him because of his control over the media. With that said, their comparative will never work. First then, on happiness. Opposition's analysis is a kind of a one-liner, that being happy makes you happy, and that's therefore a good thing. This misses what we told you in first, that oftentimes individuals sacrifice current happiness for potential future happiness in an infinite cycle of regression and delaying that never ends. Individuals always think that there'll be something better and therefore don't enjoy the present moment. No response from their team. Second, we told you that the way in which you attempt to achieve happiness is crucially important. If you attempt to achieve happiness through constantly striving, as opposition side would have you believe, that is unlikely to succeed. Because first, most individuals don't achieve success. And second, the process of working towards that success generates unhappiness because individuals have to sacrifice many things in order to achieve that. The comparative on our side is that people are content with what they have. I think both sides agree that most people are mediocre. That is just a natural fact about the fact that most people cannot be successful by their metrics. If that is true, then more people are happy on our side because their lives are glorified, a key benefit that they have not described. Second, let's engage with their grounds on productivity. Our first thing to note here is that this contradicts their stance. If individuals have many differing notions of success, then it is unlikely that these will exactly cohere with societal notions of productivity. If individuals self-define success, then it's unlikely to be economic in nature if you buy the argument of opposition. This moreover contradicts things like spending time with your family, for example, because these are what create a notion of mediocrity, which opposition themselves think is bad. So they need to choose one or the other, and they can't have both. Moreover, the examples here are wrong. The opening of a food bank, for example, contributes to a mediocre life because it means you're not able, for example, to be a successful person in a corporate firm if you have to sacrifice that success in order to help others. These examples of charitable giving actually create a mediocre life rather than a life of success. And this is true because we've shown why the definition of success will be societally defined rather than self-defined. Hence, opposition cannot have the benefits of things like helping others. Moreover, even if it is true that things like innovation and productivity decrease on our side, the impacts of this have not been proven. We would argue that currently there is overproductivity in many fields. Look at useless jobs, for example, like consulting or analysts in major corporate firms. Increasing productivity in these firms is not particularly important if the job itself is unimportant. So opposition cannot merely prove that they improve productivity, they need to show a clear impact. No, thank you. Finally, under this, on their argument of shame. I would argue this is symmetric because opposition also shames those who lead mediocre lives. The way up here is that more people lead mediocre lives than try hard. So structurally, opposition shames more people than us. Final question then on minorities. I would first note that opposition's case is largely hyperbolic. If they want to talk about the worst cases of oppression or structural discrimination, this is not mediocrity and therefore does not fall within the ambit of this motion. I think it is quite demeaning for them to say that minorities recognize their own situations as mediocre. Obviously, if minorities are actively being disenfranchised, they will know that this is not normal and not mediocre and fight for their rights. Secondly, we would argue that individuals like minorities are more harmed on their side of the house when they attempt to succeed but repeatedly fail. They have not contested our structural analysis, but why minorities are unlikely to succeed on their side of the house for a multitude of reasons, like the fact that they are disprivileged in society. So if opposition continually pushes them to try to succeed, then they will fail and they will become disillusioned with the system on opposition side of the house. When they try repeated times, they will simply give up, and therefore opposition's benefits don't only not manifest, they actively harm minorities because they cannot glorify the mediocrity they are consigned to. Finally, on their important argument on having different definitions of mediocrity. We prove from the start of our speech why this is unlikely to be true, because the notion of a mediocre life being glorified is largely one that is perpetrated by homogenous institutions like newspapers, for instance. So it's very unclear why where these differing notions of mediocrity come from. But secondly, and this is important, if this argument is true, we think it is a good thing. Why is this true? Opposition's case implies that, for example, an American definition of mediocrity is different from a Bangladeshi definition of mediocrity. That therefore means that to an American person, a life that a Bangladeshi person leads is subpar and below the level of mediocrity that they glorify. The incentive, therefore, is actually to help people in Bangladesh and the developing world so as to raise them to the level of American mediocrity by resolving the many issues that they face. So in fact, that people have differing definitions of mediocrity is a good thing, because those who have higher definitions of mediocrity are more likely to help those who have lower ones. Why does this incentive exist? Because of our glorification of the mediocre life. Individuals in America now think the American mediocre life is something that people deserve, that's something that is good to lead, and therefore have a great incentive to help others. I'm going to continue to extend on this and clash with their argument on minorities in my third argument on reducing greed. But before that, yes.
Given that the narrative affects different groups to different extents, is it more or less likely that someone at a lower position would buy into this, but a person with a higher ability would think this narrative doesn't affect them as much, which widens the existing wealth gap?
You haven't shown why individuals at high levels won't buy into this. And if it is true that these individuals don't buy into our narrative on our side, I suggest your benefits vanish too, because presumably these individuals will continue to be productive on our side, even if our narratives exist. So they either need to choose that POI or the rest of their case. They can't have both. My third argument is on reducing greed. The premise of this argument is that greed is the primary driver of inequality and other social ills. I think this is rather intuitive. Policies that promote, for example, the accumulation of wealth or promoting social inequalities for the benefit of a small minority only happen because individuals within those groups think that more successful lives are better and therefore want to save those lives for themselves. The basis of greed, therefore, is the glorification of success which exists in the world of opposition. We get rid of this on our side because we promote the narrative that a successful life is not necessarily good and a mediocre life sometimes can be better. Therefore, individuals who are in positions of privilege no longer have an incentive to pursue a greater amount of success by consigning greater amounts of wealth to themselves, and rather probably have more of an incentive to give those things up. This takes place in opposition's best case. Even if wealthy individuals have differing notions of mediocrity to everyone else, at the very least, they don't try to accumulate more wealth on opposition's side of the house if they believe that mediocrity is something they have already achieved. That proves that individuals won't accumulate on their side. In the absence of that, they're more likely to they're more likely to default to incentives like innate notions of fairness, for example. And one example we see this is in Buddhism. Buddhism is a religion which glorifies the mediocre life. And in countries which are highly Buddhist, we see some of the highest rates of charitable giving in the world. Thailand, for example, has one of the highest rates of donation in the world, despite being not a very wealthy country. This is the comparative on our side. When individuals think the mediocre life is better, they are more likely to help individuals who lead such lives. Why does this not contradict the notion of glorifying the mediocre life? Because if you help everyone in society, that does not contradict the glorification of mediocre life. Because a mediocre life, as opposition points out, is the average. If therefore you raise the average for everyone in society, you can continue to glorify the mediocre life while helping these individuals. That is important because these are the people who actually have the power to change things in society rather than minorities that they rely on. For all of these reasons, we believe that mediocrity of the mind is the strength of the soul. We are proud to propose.
I think the second proposition speaker for that fine speech call upon the second opposition speaker. Hear, hear.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Cool. Okay, yeah, just a reminder, I prefer my POIs to be verbal. Okay. I disagree with Singapore when they tell us that if you tell someone more than one thing is good, they'll just get confused, because I don't think that's true. I do think working hard at school is important. I also like spending time with my siblings. I also think that honesty and integrity are important, and that shouldn't come into conflict with how well I do at school. These are up to 3 different things that I can value, and none of them make me a confused person. In fact, I'm happy in all 3 aspects of my life. And as a result, I think I'm a much more fulfilled person than I would have been otherwise. 4 sections to rebuttal before getting into substantive on the subjective standards of happiness. First off, on happiness as a general concept. Firstly, we would contest whether success is zero-sum anyways. We actually think when we have a narrative that people should work hard instead of a narrative that frowns upon working hard, we can actually have more people work hard and succeed. Because the only analysis they give us is that some things are out of your control. But the existence of some things being out of your control just means that there is a cap on how successful you can probably be. It means that, however, you can get really, really close to that cap by working hard, as opposed to being really, really far from it, and therefore having much less success than you otherwise would have done by working hard. They then tell us that success is relative to your surroundings. But at the same time, Bill Gates is going to splash his face all over things, and therefore you're going to be really, really sad. This is confusing. I don't live near Bill Gates, and therefore he is not my surroundings. In fact, we don't think people compare themselves just to all these celebrities that they see online, even if there is some exposure to them, because the majority of the exposure you get are from the many interactions that you have with people all the time around you, from your family members, from your peers. Yeah, I might see a magazine with Bill Gates on it every once in a while, but that exposure is significantly less than everything else. On top of that, even when I see that magazine of Bill Gates, I don't compare myself to him because I don't think of him as really equivalent to myself. Instead, when I see someone else in my peers exist, I can see, wow, that person, John, I know exactly what John is like. John is that kid in my class. I know who John is. I can picture myself in John's shoes because I know the details of his life and his school and how he works. So when John succeeds, it raises more questions about why I can't succeed. I don't really know Bill Gates intimately. That's why I don't compare myself to him as much. As a result, we think firstly, success isn't zero-sum and is far more attainable than they suggest. And on top of that, success doesn't mean you have to be Bill Gates and is therefore a lot more attainable. You just have to be successful within the reasonable standards you set for yourself. But thirdly, they tell you that people are going to delay happiness and be anxious. Firstly, we don't think people will be anxious about the fear of losing their success. Because once you're able to build up things that you are successful in and are proud of, those memories and those accomplishments stay with you forever, even if you don't constantly have them. You're still able to point back at those old accomplishments and feel a sense of pride in them. On top of that, we don't think people are likely to delay happiness. We concede some people might get sucked into the status hamster wheel and might unfortunately be unhappy, but the vast majority of people won't. Why is this the case? Because we think we value money not for inherent money purposes. The fact that we live in a capitalist structure doesn't fundamentally rewire our brains and make us think that this piece of money, because it's this piece of paper, because it's green, is inherently valuable and what we should chase our lives. The fact is we care a lot about things like family, the emotional deep relationships we build with other people. We care a lot about the values like hard work and being like hard work. In fact, we would actually say that as a result, people value money only as a gateway to those things. People value money because it means you don't have to work 3 jobs at minimum wage. You are able to actually work a job that has 40 hours a week and then spend time with your kids. You are able to work a job and therefore that probably reflects that you work hard and is a valuable meritocratic trait for other people to have. As a result, we think that when people have money, they're either going to use it to signal those other virtues in society, or they're going to use it to chase the things that make them happy in the first place. Fourthly, then, on this notion of rebutting our arguments about how basically if someone sets up a food bank, they won't be seen as successful. Firstly, again, we think that success is relative. Just because you set up a food bank and haven't made a Fortune 500 company doesn't mean you're not successful. But on top of that, again, we don't think success is just tied to money, because we say that CEOs are great people because they've made a huge contribution to society and have presumably worked really hard to do it. If you set up a food bank, you have done similar things. You've worked really hard and you've made a major contribution to society. We think people will still value those things and see it as a form of success. I'm going to be adding more analysis on happiness in our last piece of substantive, but I think that's enough rebuttal for now. Secondly, then, on the idea of minorities, before that, I'll take that point.
Your argument is that people will only compare against their own communities rather than against TV, social media, or other forms of media. Therefore, your arguments on minorities rising up.
Right. Why is this not the case? Because even if a minority doesn't think, I now have to make a Fortune 500 company, they can still succeed relative within their communities, and as a community as a whole can make gradual steps forward. Yeah, they're not going to be millionaires overnight, but you can have, for example, a community that sends almost no kids to university start to send a couple kids every year. So secondly, that brings us perfectly to this idea of minorities. They tell us, firstly, it's not about suffering. Well, this was never about people starving on the streets, but inequality still exists. The fact is, if certain people have to work a minimum wage job job. They might not be starving, but it is definitely less fair that they were much more likely to end up a job that has more backbreaking labor for them. That means that they have less time to spend with their kids than someone who was born just into a different zip code and therefore was far less likely to live that life. Yeah, people aren't suffering and dying, but that type of structural inequality is really, really hard to see. There's nothing inherently wrong about working a low-level job in the same way there's something inherently wrong with starvation. So people are extremely unlikely to point out these structural inequalities, and therefore we think they are harder to see. Well, secondly on that, this idea that people will be disillusioned if they're unsuccessful. Firstly, again, note that successful is relative and more attainable, but we also think it is more important for some people in that community to succeed, even if some other people are a little bit more sad that they didn't succeed. Because those people who are more successful are able to go abroad and, are able to go to university. They're able to send more money home in the form of remittances. They're able to improve the reputation of their ethnic group as a whole, possibly get into management level positions where they're able to hire more people within that community. And thirdly, then on this notion that people want to help because they want to donate, we don't think that this is the case. People only really want to help in the case of clear suffering, again, something that is inherently bad. So on their note that like Buddhist people are going to be like more generous, firstly, we're going to prove later why actually people on our side of the house earn more, and therefore even if they donate less as a percentage, they're still going to donate more money. But on top of that, it's just not clear why you would want to give your money. Just because you have extra money to give doesn't mean you're going to give it because you think that someone's unmediocre life is an injustice in the way that someone's suffering and starving is an injustice. Fourthly, then, on that note of innovation, note that almost none of this was actually responded, so I'm going to leave all of Madeline's analysis standing, other than this note that it was a tension. This was not a tension. The fact that mediocrity has different definitions means that different groups will respond differently. But the ideal society is when all groups push themselves to be as useful as possible. So yes, the people at the top, if they push themselves as hard as possible, are likely to be able to innovate and do things like make new medicines. That is useful in and of itself. But people at the bottom who are also just able to go to university, become a doctor or a lawyer, are able to contribute in their own way. That's not a tension, that's nuance. Lastly, then, on the subjective standards of happiness. Firstly, that people are different, right? We think people are just genetically born different. They're raised by different parents. They grow up with different values. Some people want to be mothers and fathers. Some people want to focus on a more careerist thing. People just find happiness in different things in life. We don't think everyone is the same. But mediocrity espouses a very specific life where you are just generally okay in everything. That means it is extremely unlikely they're going to support, and in fact, as they say, will actually criticize people who spend a lot of time focusing on their careers. And therefore, people are going to be, people who naturally might want to focus on the career because they just aren't interested in having a family, which is totally fine, or people who are vice versa, really like spending time with kids and wanting to raise a family, but have very little interest in having a career. All of those things should be fine, and people should be free to pursue those anyways. But on their side of the house, people will be pressured into thinking they have to be mediocre in everything. Because if I fail in having a family, that's bad. If I fail in not having a job, that's also bad. On their side of the house, people will live their lives of mediocrity until they're 40 or 50 and realize they're not truly happy. They will wonder why they're happy. They will think that they're broken because everyone else around them seems to be living this mediocre life that has been glorified. Those are the people who end up having those 40-year-old, 50-year-old midlife crises because they spent their whole lives not pursuing what they want, but what other people told them they want.
Great. I think the second opposition speaker for that fine speech call up the third proposition speaker. Hear, hear.
Hi. Can everyone hear me and see me?
Yep, you're good.
Thank you very much. Two strategic observations at the top of this speech. One, thus far, opposition has identified a lot of problems. Problems of poverty, problems of inequality. They have not given us a single mechanism for why under their side of the house, they actually get these problems solved. Insofar as I can prove that we do better on them on this metric, we already win. Second strategic observation. Second opposition makes a concession. She says that people define success relative to their surroundings. If this claim is true, then all of their arguments about how minorities might rise up on their side of the house are now out of this debate. because unfortunately, these communities are largely unsuccessful through no fault of their own. So therefore, if they want to argue that under outside of the house, people are going to define success relative to their surroundings, this means on their side of the house, minority communities are still going to continue defining success relative to their community. They can't claim their benefits on helping minorities then. I'm going to ask 3 questions. 1, on which side do we make people happier? 2, on productivity. 3, on helping minorities. 1, on which side do we make people significantly happier? We began this debate with a simple claim. Unfortunately for all of us in this room, most of us are probably going to be mediocre for the structural reasons we gave you. Honestly, the second opposition gives a response, but it doesn't challenge any of the reasons we gave you. All she says is that you can receive more success even if it's not absolute success if you work hard, so you won't always be mediocre. This misses the point, because what we argued was that more success is never enough. Look, even in their best case, if you don't compare yourself to Bill Gates, the point we made is that success must be relative. So let's say you don't compare yourself to a Fortune 500 CEO. You will still compare yourself to the person who got the promotion instead of you. You will still compare yourself to someone ahead of yourself and above you in the career chain. Why is this important? Because even if people achieve things and can do relatively better, better is never enough insofar as success is continually to be defined relatively. We made this claim about how success is defined relatively in first, we heard no response. This means they have to concede that on both sides of the house, people largely are going to be mediocre themselves. We argue that given that most people cannot structurally achieve success most of the time, this means that opposition's comparative, one of hyper-capitalist consumerism, which is the metric for success, is one that is damaging to these individuals. We gave you 3 reasons they never responded. First, innate competition between individuals. Second, about how the wealthy can control this narrative for their personal gain because of the media. And note that their response about Bill Gates is insufficient, because even if on an objective level we might not compare ourselves to Bill Gates, the fact that Bill Gates can plaster his face, as my second speaker already said, the fact that Warren Buffett can put his face on Time magazine, on every single thing we read and say, this is what success looks like. The fact that our parents might compare ourselves to them, this is something the wealthy can do and they can control this narrative. The third reason we gave you is that money is just something that people generally like and they desire. None of these reasons were responded to down the bench. All we get is a counter assertion that in their world, they can have a plethora of different comparatives, like working hard and spending time with your family. This is incredibly problematic. 1, we thought this was very contradictory because often these narratives tend to undermine one another. Second, people can appreciate nuance without getting confused. No, thank you. This is problematic because at the point where these narratives directly contradict one another, people must make an overt prioritization of which narrative is more important. What does this mean? On their side of the house, when you tell a worker, for instance, that you should spend more time working as hard as you can in the workplace, at the same time you should come home and help your children, it's fairly obvious that these narratives are directly contradictory, meaning that the narrative which is more powerful wins out. Given that we have given you 3 reasons for why the more powerful narrative is the narrative of consumerism, even if that narrative of coming home to your family exists to some extent, this is largely outweighed by the more powerful narrative. So even if you have both narratives, the 3 reasons I outlined earlier prove that the more powerful narrative is capitalism, something they must stand for. What are the impacts then? Given that most people are never going to be satisfied with their success for things like the hedonistic treadmill, something they just wanted to dismiss by saying only some people feel it. No, we tell you a vast majority of people feel it because of human psychology. When you get something, you often feel like you want more because after a while you get desensitized to the pleasure you receive and you desire more from that. Why is this important? Because on their side of the house, people enter midlife crisis. People get depression when they feel that they aren't achieving anything with their lives. I think this is a massive harm when people become incredibly unhappy. It's not just mere unhappiness. I suspect this can manifest itself in terms of chronic illnesses mentally, for instance. So this is a massive harm they have yet to countenance for. We told you we made people far happier. No, thank you. Because under our side of the house, people generally did feel better when, even if they didn't achieve massive levels of success, we normalized this and told them this was okay. That's why we win on this clash. People are far happier in our world. I'm now going to talk about the second clash on productivity. Before I go on, I'll take the point.
Given men are often deemed to be more competent and women almost always have to fight when there is one spot for promotion, is it more or less likely that women will obtain it when they're no longer encouraged to fight for it?
I'm going to deal with this under my third clash. I'll flag you out when I deal with it. Now, let's look at the problems with productivity. The first thing I'd like to point out is that this contradicts their claim on a plethora of narratives. Presumably, if people believe in a plethora of narratives, they have less incentive to be productive. What they've done is they've mitigated their claims to a very, very large extent insofar as the plethora exists. Second response, up until now, they have not given us a single reason for why productivity is incredibly important, especially after my second speaker has given you a lot of analysis about why often productivity is something that is being overemphasized in the workplace currently. So this is something they have not answered for. I suspect if it means that fewer people get depression, and even if it means you have to give up on one more innovation, whatever this innovation is. If fewer people get depression, I think that's a price we're willing to pay. So you have not impacted this clash at all. It's too late to do so in third opposition. They can't try that. I'm now going to move on to my third clash on helping minorities. The first thing I'd like to point out, They never responded to any of our argumentation about dispelling the notion that minorities are lazy. We told them and asked them on their side of the house, when a poor African-American individual, a poor Jamaican immigrant is structurally unable to succeed in life, not because of any fault of his own, because of structural barriers, people will stigmatize him as lazy. People will say these communities aren't working hard at achieving anything. We made this argument at first and we heard absolutely no response. Third opposition is too late. The only response we get is a static response from first to second. They tell us that different conceptions of mediocrity exist. So the poor generally have a standard of mediocrity that's unfairly low. We have to, and here's where I'm going to clash directly with the PY they made. Two responses. One, it's fairly obvious that on our side of the house, the media can promote a consistent standard for what this looks like. So we can often do things as we characterize in our first proposition speech by telling people that mediocrity looks like this. It looks like, for instance, having a decent middle class life, maybe not driving the most expensive flashy car. We told you that media does have the influence to do this. Notably, they have to concede to this on their side of the house as well, because if they want their narratives to work, then they must also concede that the media can propagate these narratives successfully too. So this is a concession they must accept. Second, we bit the bullet. We said on their best case, let's say these exist. No, we told you why this was a good thing. Insofar as the discrepancy between, as the analogy my second speaker gave you, between a US worker or someone from the United Kingdom and someone from a third world country, if this person in the developed country looks at the person in the third world country and believes that this person's standard of living is below mediocrity, that's when people are far more likely and far more incentivized to donate. The response we get is, well, people aren't incentivized to donate at all because people are generally selfish. And this misses the point of the second speaker argument we made, something that they never engaged with as well. What did we argue in our second speaker argument? We made it clear, even if it's true on their very best case, that the poor feel less of an incentive to improve their lives. This is outweighed by how a vast majority of privileged people tend to feel. We argue that these narratives can affect how privileged people view their lives. And we gave you structural reasons they have yet to respond to. And again, third proposition is too late. Why is this important? Because it translates into a willingness to support things like higher taxes, to fund things like welfare programs. Because now you no longer care as much about your own success and your own wealth. Because you don't mind me being mediocre and you much rather someone else didn't have to live the life of being mediocre. What does this look like? It looks like a rich person being willing to give up a Mercedes for a Toyota to pay higher taxes, even though it might lead to a more mediocre and average life for them, because they would rather other people didn't live this life. This was an argument we made in our second speaker that proves why we help racial minorities and people who are socioeconomically privilege. We have yet to hear a response, and again, third opposition is far too late. What have I proven thus far, and where do we stand in the debate? First, given that most people are likely to be mediocre, we allow them to be content with themselves. Second, we help minorities when people are far more willing to do things like donate and make sacrifices on their part to help them. Third, a vast majority of people feel incredibly insufficient in the world of opposition because of their hyper-capitalist comparative. For all of these reasons, mediocrity of the mind is the strength of the soul we propose.
I think the third proposition speaker for that fine speech call upon the third opposition speaker. Hear, hear.
I would prefer my POIs verbally. Team Singapore thinks that a revolutionary activist or a doctor working in a Red Cross for negligible salaries would not be considered successful. But Singapore doesn't just fail to understand the nuance of our case, they actively close their eyes to it. This blatant ignorance on this question and so many others is why Singapore lost this debate. First question, which side produces a better society? Second question, which side is better for minorities? And third question, which side is better for happiness? On to our first question then, as to which side produces a better society. From first, Madeline has already told you why we get more productive societies. We gave you a series of mechanisms of why people will be less productive, which Singapore just tried to shrug off by saying it's going to be symmetric. We said that in education, they will be driven to set lower goals and that there's reduced encouragement in their life, which is imperative because achieving success is so difficult and paved with risk that we need all the encouragement possible to counter this narrative that success is difficult and it's not worth it. But secondly, we also discussed shame and how that both unjustly punishes those who have devoted their life to benefiting society, either economically through the forced altruism of capitalism or charitably through opening a girls' legal clinic, and discourages future individuals from striving for success. This is debate winning. because Singapore seems to think that you can trick yourself into being happy with literally anything. That's untrue. If I'm in agonizing pain from a late-term terminal illness because nobody has driven and had the attempt to cure me for that very illness, this far outweighs the possible marginal happiness from not being sad because you're not a mega millionaire. We'd rather gain the utility from saving lives and maybe give up a little bit of that minuscule marginal happiness that Singapore gets. What did they say in response to this? They told us that 1, charitable giving creates a mediocre life, so people aren't going to do it. 1, this was just a completely ridiculous claim, right? Because Singapore just repeated this by insisting that the only measure of success is economic well-being. To put it in simplest terms, Gandhi was poor, but I don't think anyone here would characterize him as unsuccessful. When you clearly help so many lives through a charity, potentially transforming the life of an impoverished child or an abused woman, it's pretty darn intuitive to think that is the definition of successful. Then they say that you probably get far less, they're going to get more donations on their side when people are more altruistic. But we think that you're probably going to get far less donations because that wealth doesn't really accumulate. On to the second question then, as to which side is better for minorities. We told you from first how their narrative further entrenches existing inequalities, that there is indeed a different metric of what is considered mediocre. It's interesting that Singapore thinks everyone only views acceptable success as one that Bill Gates has, when most of us probably don't feel that that is going to be the average bar of success. This narrative is most harmful when it's not applied equally to all groups. If you listen to the language that they use, this narrative should comfort those who are the least successful and maximize their contentment. This means then that it is likely those very individuals who are far more likely to buy into this narrative. This concedes to all of the structural analysis that we told you. 1, minorities might not live in destitution. We understand that, but many still work in low-paying jobs. Many still live in conditions where they have extreme large room for improvement, where they can seek a better job, where they can seek a better promotion, where they can seek a higher socioeconomic status. But 2, those who already lead better lives view mediocrity as not getting into a top 50 uni. This is a huge gap that proposition had to concede. The existing inequality worsens when those at the bottom accept their sad versions of reality, and those at the top may accept it, but they still strive to work harder because they're counter-existing narratives from their parents that tell them that working hard is important. You don't get that very same narratives from the families of people who are at the bottom. This is debate winning because we tell those minorities that they can strive for better, that they further force minorities to accept the oppression they face, to accept that it's okay that New York schools in New York are still segregated even after so many educational bills have been attempted to be passed. If Singapore believes that people compare among each other, then those at rock bottom will feel even worse than those at the top. We think that you can only be content and mediocrity, but by the very mechanisms that proposition give us, it only flips their case back to Hong Kong. Here they say that we are quote unquote tense because if people compare themselves to their near vicinity, then minorities won't be incentivized to succeed. Yeah, you can compare yourself to those around you, but this doesn't mean that every single African American is the same, that they all have the same jobs, that they all have the same socioeconomic status. There is still variation, and that variation is not enough to cause you crippling depression, but you can still look at them as sources of inspiration. We think that this is quite offensive for Singapore to characterize the entire minority population as one that is homogenous, one where there's no variation, and one that they're all quote unquote useless failures. Then they tell us that individuals don't try to accumulate more wealth because of this narrative, so you don't get things like exacerbating social inequality. Singapore doesn't seem to understand something very simple, so I'm going to make it clear. Different narratives affect different people differently. We have told you this from first. We don't know why they have such a hard time grasping this, because minorities are probably going to believe this narrative far more. So sure, this narrative also exists for the rich, but it's going to have far less impact. If you are rich and successful, it's far more likely that your parents are going to emphasize working hard and striving for more because they think it's important. On the other hand, an African-American mother who is perpetually stuck working at the local grocery store is probably going to emphasize this narrative far less. Yeah, she wants her son to succeed, but she thinks that it's very hard for them to do better, that her son is resigned to the same future. So it's probably a safer option for him to get a job at 18 fresh out of high school instead of going into university. We think that this applies far less to rich people, and they're probably going to continue to do things like accumulate wealth because that's what they have been told from their parents who themselves have succeeded. You don't get these same family narratives from people who are stuck, people who are perpetually stuck in the same cycle of having an average job and at times jobs that are not even successful in the first place. happiness. Then they told you that notions of mediocrity are used to characterize minorities and to justify their oppression. One, we think that it is for this very reason that it is more important to tell minorities that they can succeed, that although they might be the first ones in their families to go to school or attend universities, that they should take this risk because it's going to be beneficial for them. The way you help minorities is not by telling them that they should be happy with where they are. The way you help them is by telling them that they can break out of the cycle and they have the ability to do so, and that they don't need to be stuck in this perpetual life of just working within your own community and never striving for something better. It's funny that Proposition thinks that mediocrity is why there's like massive Islamophobia within the United Kingdom and France, that this is how like minority by oppressions are used, oppression for minorities are used, and not the fact that politicians actively whip up the sentiment because it's beneficial for political will. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
On which side of the house are people more willing to donate to the poor? When donating means giving up your life as someone who is privileged and successful, or when giving up your money doesn't really mean anything from a stigma perspective because it's okay to be mediocre?
Yeah, but the problem is that narratives don't exist from a vacuum, right? A rich person will be told by his parents that success is far more important, as opposed to an African-American working mother who does believe that she wants her son to succeed, but thinks that it is far harder, so she hammers that less into him. We think that it's the fact that it's not only this one singular narrative that is going to exist. On to the third question then, as to which side is better for happiness. We told you that there are things like subjective standards of happiness. Jenna has told you that not everyone is going to be happy with a mediocre life. Not everyone wants just what is normal, and not everyone just wants the average living, because there are different standards of happiness. All they say to this is, but conflicted narratives will lead to people having to prioritize. Yes, this is going to be good because people will prioritize to reflect what personally makes them the happiest. Even if there is a capitalist narrative, some people will work overtime once a week, others twice, some every night. Everyone should be able to make that very call for themselves. Then they say to this that they are the ones who make people happier because success is difficult and it might not always be achievable. Firstly, note the issue with them saying that is that they will broadcast a uniform standard of mediocrity. That standard in developed countries is not attainable for a lot of people, especially minorities. So they lose out on the whole metric of happiness must be accessible. But secondly, we don't even agree with their idea of success. It doesn't need to only be contingent on the outcome. The narrative of success is not just money equals good. In reality, the narrative is far more nuanced than that. Sure, money is good, but so is the experience of trying. The process matters. It's lessons you learn along the way. The only response to this is that this is confusing. No, people can acknowledge that success is more than wealth, and it encapsulates the process of trying as well. We're not too sure what's too confusing about that. But lastly, let's take them at their best. We agree that success can be difficult and not everyone is going to succeed, so we acknowledge that. All they say to this is that the wealthy control the narrative, but they then try to walk down to your claim by saying, oh, you're only going to compare to the people next to you. They can't choose both characterizations. We think that they can only choose one. At the end of the day, Proposition's best case involves a trade-off between people being sad because they don't think of themselves as successful, or being sad because their sister is dying because nobody is willing to innovate a cure for her disease. At the end of the day, we're far happier to choose the latter.
Great. I thank the third opposition speaker for that fine speech. Call upon the opposition reply. Hear, hear.
Okay, cool. Can everyone hear me? Happiness isn't enough for a good life because it depends on the type of society you live in. Are the services you need there? Are the things that you need there so that you're able to actually access things like basic financial security, legal help when you need it, medical help when you need it? Is it enough that you're able to overcome inequalities so that the outcomes of your life are as much in your control as possible? And the question is, happiness must be able to adapt itself to different people because not everyone is satisfied with these same things. Otherwise, on side proposition, they have to contend with the fact that happiness and a good life ultimately lose their meaning. 3 questions in this reply. Firstly, let's address productivity, because the only response they were ever able to give us to the first and most important argument we forwarded was that it was tense because it means different things to different people. But that never engaged with our analysis, because our analysis actually thrived on the notion that productivity means different things to different people. It means that to the people with the most ability to invest heavily, they're able to do things like create new medicine, start up new apps, start new businesses that help other people. For people who have less resources available to them, they're still able to do things like go to college and try to become doctors or lawyers or contribute to their community in the maximum effective way possible. This still means that people are able to do things like open legal clinics for battered women, volunteer and contribute at their food bank. These are all ways in people can be productive because we're not asking for everyone to contribute in one way. Every contribution is effective. All we ask is that people are willing to work hard and strive to be as effective as possible. That was what we asked for. And the impact of that was massive because these are the cases where we are able to provide better services for everyone and the basic things that they need. This is where people simply have more money to do things that they wanted to talk about, like donate. This is where the services for legal and health things are more available to you, where you have better teachers. And generally speaking, people are able to access a qualitatively better life with the resources that you have. This was never engaged with, and that alone wins us the debate. But secondly, on the idea of minorities, because firstly, let's say that the narrative of success is only one narrative, that everyone subscribes to the same thing. But listen to what we just told you, that the median narrative of success is actually tense with what they've said themselves, because that actually means that the median narrative is probably going to be something that's unattainable for the people at the bottom of that society because it caters to the middle class. So actually, all the people on their side of the house are probably still going to be disillusioned and depressed, which were the key impacts that they wanted to focus on. But what was the more likely outcome? That the narrative of success is actually going to depend on your community. And this didn't mean that we weren't able to actually forward people, because just because success is relative to your community doesn't mean that you aren't able to succeed within the scope of that community. Over generation, as time passes, everyone in that community starts to have higher and higher expectations for what success is. That is just generally useful. We think on our side of the house, we tell minorities that you're capable of more than what your father had and what your father had before him. You should not be happy with intergenerational bad luck and with the fact that you are statistically less likely to have as good a life as anyone else. Your outcome should be in your own hands. On their side of the house, they tell people, if everyone else around you seems okay with it, why should you dare to ask for more? Thirdly, then, on the idea of happiness, because we gave you a lot of reasons for why we actually think happiness is firstly attainable and secondly adaptable, and why it needs to be those things. We firstly told you that it was attainable because just because luck is a factor doesn't mean that hard work also isn't a factor. We gave you a lot of reasons why attainability does tend to be relative, and even if it's not, it tends to with their case anyways. We told you reasons such as the fact that you're much more able to picture yourself and therefore compare yourself to the people you actually know as opposed to Bill Gates. That no matter how many Time magazine's Warren Buffett puts himself on, you see Time magazine like once a year, you see the people around you and the people you live with all the time. On top of that, we told you were unlikely to continue chasing more and more things and therefore subscribe to an unattainable narrative of success. Because the fact is, people only value money for the things that can get them. There is nothing inherently useful about a sheet of paper or a check for a couple $1,000s, unless that means you have more time to spend with your family, unless that means you are able to buy the things that make you happy. To the point in which people are able to do those things, they're unlikely to keep chasing it for the sake of doing it. But lastly, we told you that happiness has to be adaptable. It is good for people to prioritize different parts of different narratives in the ways that make themselves happiest. That is actually a good thing as opposed to a bad thing on their side of the house. It might be a confusing process for some, but ultimately is the only way that people can decide what makes them happiest.
I think the opposition reply call upon the proposition reply to conclude the round. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me? Thank you. The reason why opposition's picture of success seems confusing at the end of this debate is because they attempted to pursue two contradictory outcomes. On the one hand, they wanted success to be something self-defined, presumably so that the many harms of poor self-esteem and the harms to mental health that we told you about are avoided. At the same time, they needed success to be something that is universal and motivating, pushing people towards greater productivity and forcing minorities to rise out of their present circumstances. These things cannot be true simultaneously, so either way, half of the case of opposition is lost. What does the world of opposition then look like? Opposition attempted to skirt the debate by having a multitude of self-defined notions of success. We didn't say that this was something they couldn't do. We said that this was something that would not be persuasive, that individuals would not subscribe to. First, because many of the narratives that they talk about are self-contradictory. For example, the second opposition's example about spending more time in school or spending more time with your family, obviously you can't do both of these at the same time, so individuals will have to choose. Second, we extended our third speaker to show that if there are many competing narratives, then it is likely that individuals will choose the one that is the most powerful and propagated by the most powerful actors in society. Maybe not the ultra-rich, but those who are relatively more well-off in society. This means that opposition's comparative of many notions of success does not work. The impact of this is that most people will be unhappy in the world of opposition. Why? because most people will be mediocre. At no point does opposition challenge this most basic premise of our case, that most people in general are mediocre, and most people in minority communities specifically, through no fault of their own, do happen to be mediocre. Insofar as opposition is unable to solve these problems, we have the exclusive benefit of increasing the happiness of these individuals, because they do lead mediocre lives and we glorify those lives. Importantly, their argument on trying is just not enough, because if you try and you repeatedly fail for structural factors outside your control, that is counterproductive, because you become disillusioned and all of the benefits they talk about go away, and you don't have the benefits of glorification on our side. Secondly, there is competition in the world of opposition, which generates unhappiness. Importantly, opposition must accept this outcome because it's key to their case. Their argument is that minorities will compete with one another to be able to rise out of their present circumstances, or individuals will compete with one another in order to become productive. They therefore accept our argument that competition exists and therefore generates unhappiness. Perhaps you're just comparing yourself to someone who achieved a promotion instead of you, and that is where the unhappiness comes from. So at the end of the day, I have demonstrated that people are significantly unhappy on their side of the house. What about our side? They attempted to show why productivity is a significant harm on our side. Contrary to the accusation of the third opposition speaker, we did respond to this. We showed why it wasn't a particularly important argument, given that they never impacted the outcomes of productivity. We showed there was a lot of overproductivity and status quo being wasted on unuseful fields in the very beginning. Productivity, therefore, is not an important issue in this debate. More importantly, there was a shift in their third speaker, where they attempted to say that this narrative of productivity doesn't affect this narrative of mediocrity doesn't affect the rich. This contradicts their benefits, because if the rich continue to subscribe to their narrative in our side of the house, then presumably all of the benefits of productivity and working hard also manifest, because rich individuals don't believe mediocrity to be beneficial. Either way, they lose a lot of this. Secondly, we showed that in proposition's world, we help the disprivileged better. Opposition attempted to argue that there were differing notions of mediocrity on different sides of the economic spectrum, for example. We agreed that this might be the case in limited circumstances, and we said that this was a good thing. This is a greater incentive for individuals to help those whose standard of living falls below their notion of mediocrity. We didn't just prove that this was something that could happen, we proved it was something that was likely to happen. When individuals discard notions of success and glorify the mediocre life, they are more likely to help individuals reach that standard of living. At the end of the day, even if this is not true, the clear benefit that we have is that individuals no longer accumulate wealth. Even if they don't give that wealth away, they no longer support policies that specifically hold that wealth within their own communities, at the very least getting rid of these counterproductive policies. For those reasons, we believed that mediocrity mediocrity of the mind is the strength of the soul. We are proud to propose.
Great. I thank the opposition reply and all debaters in the round for what was an excellent round. Virtually cross the floor and shake hands, I guess. Are there breakout rooms in this meeting?
JT?
Breakout room has already been opened. You can join the judge room anytime.
I can't see it for some reason.
Okay, wait a few seconds. Yes, okay, so sorry.
Neither can I.
Okay, 1 second.
Sorry.
I have just opened the breakout room. I think you can join it now.
Great. If we all just want to hop into the judge room for deliberation, that'd be great.
Thank you very much to the debate team Hong Kong. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a great round.
Yep.